welcome back to A Mighty Fortress is Our Pod. Today's guest is Pastor Kerstin Hedlund, Director of Contextual Education at Trinity Lutheran Seminary and Reservist Army Chaplain. So I am here with Pastor Kerstin Hedlund. She is the Director of Contextual Education at Trinity Lutheran Seminary and also an Army Chaplain in Reserve. So Pastor Hedlund, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So let's just begin with where did your journey with the church start?
I suppose this sounds fairly Lutheran to say that my journey with the church started before I even knew I had a journey with the church. My parents brought me to church when I was a baby. I was baptized as an infant. My dad was in the military when I was growing up, and we moved around from place to place. But no matter where we lived, one of the first things that we did was found a church community, whether it was on a military installation or at a local parish, oftentimes Lutheran parishes. And so being a part of the church, again, was a part of my life before I even knew that it was a part of my life.
So I guess first of all, what branch was your dad? And then what were some of the places you lived in growing up?
Yeah, so my dad was in the Air Force. He was a JAG, which is a lawyer for the Air Force, and worked on various projects and various assignments. So some of the places where I lived were Ohio, D.C., Southern California, Boston, Massachusetts, and Honolulu as a kid. He had some overseas assignments both before I was born and then while we were living in Honolulu. So kind of all over that country, at least as a child.
And you said you attended mostly or all Lutheran churches during that time. Were these congregations like military specific congregations, like on the base, or were they just nearby churches?
Yeah, so some of the congregations that I was a part of were actually not necessarily specifically Lutheran when we participated on in base chapel communities. So they were um, non-denominational Protestant. Sometimes we would go, the installations also had gospel services, so sometimes we would go to the gospel service on base and get a different flair and a different perspective. When we attended churches off post, typically those churches were near the installation, and typically they were Lutheran. My parents both grew up in what was called the Covenant Congregationalist Church, a Swedish covenant church, um, kind of a pietist offshoot of Lutheranism. I rooted in Lutheran identity, but there weren't that many of those churches in the various places that we lived. So oftentimes Lutheran was the closest to home for them.
You mentioned the Swedish churches. So is there some ancestry there that led you to that specific denomination, or just
Again, this was more my parents' story than my story, but their story is a part of my story. They grew up in a very, very Swedish community, and a lot of people kind of, as churches do now and churches have done in the past in the states. Sometimes when immigrant communities came to the states, uh, they would continue worshiping in the ways that they did in their own language, and so the community in which they live was a heavily Swedish community.
yeah, absolutely. So um, I guess what developed first for you? The sense that you wanted to go into ministry, or the sense that you wanted to go into the military, or kind of both?
That's a really good question, and I don't know for sure. Um, but I think in some way they were concurrent. I kind of remember from an early age, even junior high, that I felt some kind of call to some kind of um, specific ministry. I also, having grown up in the military, enjoyed moving around, getting to meet people from different cultures, different contexts, different perspectives, and also felt a call to the military. So what I thought I was going to do um, was go into the military and serve some time, get out of the military, and go back to seminary. But again, what happened was I kind of did them concurrently. I did ROTC in undergrad, so that was training to be a military officer. During that time while I was training to be a military officer, I felt like maybe I shouldn't be doing that, that I should be focusing more on what do I need to do to prepare myself to go to seminary and potentially into ordained ministry. Um, but for whatever reason, or for various reasons, there was something that was keeping me in that training and in the military. And when I discovered that there was an opportunity to join something after graduation, I got branched as an intelligence officer, but found out that there was something called a chaplain candidate program. So I was able to have the intelligence branch hold my slot and let me try to go to seminary for a year, 2 years, 3 years, however long. And if that didn't work out, I would go back to intelligence. So I joined the chaplain candidate program and ended up going to seminary
Yeah.
with the idea of coming back as a military chaplain.
Okay. Yeah. Actually, I want to talk a little bit about that process just so people kind of understand what that looks like. I guess it's first of all, though, so you did Army ROTC. Is there a particular reason you went Army as opposed to Air Force like your dad or something else? Or
I wish I had a really good, smart reason to tell you, but honestly, when I went in for ROTC scholarships at the time, the Air Force had scholarships for people who wanted to be, I think it was like meteorologists and physicists. And even though I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do, I was pretty sure that that wasn't it, or I didn't want to be locked into that. And because the Army is just a bigger branch, there were more opportunities to say, I want to major in whatever, and there were still scholarships available. So that, again, not a really fun answer, but that's why the Army.
so, yeah, I guess back to the chaplaincy process then.
Mhm.
You first enlisted in the military and then enrolled in seminary. Is
Correct.
that how it's always done? Is there a particular order? Like what does that look like? And I guess what does that look like in relation to being a part of a denomination too? Were you affiliated with a particular denomination as you're going through this, or were you just kind of I guess almost assigned to the military like as your context?
Sure. No, that's a good question. And yes, to a lot of those answers, or yes is an answer to. So it sounds like there were quite a few
Yes.
questions in that. Um, so there are different ways that one can enter the military as a chaplain, and somebody can already have served in the military and uh, become a chaplain later after having served in a different branch or in a different area in the military. Sometimes people feel called to military chaplaincy, though, after they're called to ordained ministry.
Mhm.
And so some people, whether they're Lutheran or other denominations, serve as pastors in their communities and then um, come into the military as what would be called a direct commission as a chaplain. So that may answer part of
Yes,
that
yes, I think it does.
question.
So I guess in your case, did you attend a Lutheran seminary?
Yes,
Okay.
I did. And in my case, as is the case for every chaplain, I should say, every chaplain is called to serve um, people across, a broad spectrum of religions. We are called to provide for the free exercise of religion within the Department of Defense and to prevent against the establishment of. That's one of our primary roles. And every chaplain does have what is called an endorser, an endorsing body that is representative of their church. So I, as a Lutheran, could and would come into the chaplain corps as a Lutheran pastor. So I went actually here to Trinity Lutheran Seminary, and then, as the Lutheran process goes, served a parish down in Texas for my first call, and then was released to active duty to serve as a Lutheran chaplain in the military, serving all people in the military.
So once you begin actively serving as a chaplain, I guess compare and contrast that to both maybe a standard military deployment process and a standard call process. And I guess does it resemble either of those things, both of those things, kind of neither of those things in terms of like getting assigned a context to work in and just the time commitment for how long you'll be there and those sorts of things.
Sure, and there's different kind of layers and ways of entering into the military and serving as a chaplain, whether it's a reserve person or an active duty person or a guard person, and the level of commitment varies depending on, again, if you're active component. Typically, that is going to be your call, and that's going to be your full time job. But in recent decades, even as a guardsman or a reservist, sometimes with lots of mobilizations and deployments, that became people's full time job and full time call as they were called up and mobilized for operations going on across the world. Um, but yeah, I mean, is your question about process for entry?
Yeah. So I get you graduate seminary
Mhm,
and you're in the military. You're a chaplain.
mhm.
How did it get determined where you were going?
Sure.
Um, and I guess for how long? I know some of the people I know that have been in the military that aren't chaplains. They have like sort of a contract
Mhm,
length, right,
mhm.
for a certain number of years. Is that similar to how it is for a chaplain then as well? That you're sort of contracted, enlisted for a certain number of years as a chaplain, and they're effectively deploying you, or what does that look like?
So, you would go in as you would commission, and you would go in again, whether it's a reserve, a guard, or active duty, and the contract is different than like an enlistment contract. So, there are just ways of getting in and getting out. Again, are different,
Mhm.
but kind of the process is coming from the way that I came through, that I would be assigned to a congregation and I would serve in the Army Reserve.
Mhm.
So the church, in conversation with various entities, helped facilitate
Mhm.
my first call, and then the Army basically said, "Here's the unit that you're going to be assigned to," um, and so there's a concurrent process of, uh, assignment in the church
Mhm.
and assignment in the
So
military.
you've always been reserve.
I have been active as well.
Okay. Which came first?
Reserve.
Reserve.
Mhm,
Reserve came first. Okay. So tell me about your first church assignment
mhm.
and then what you were doing with the Army at the same time.
Okay. So, my first call was in Fort Worth, Texas, Calvary Lutheran Church. Great people, great congregation, and, lots going on in that congregation. While I was serving that congregation in my first call, I was also assigned to the 90th Sustainment Brigade, which was a unit outside of, North Little Rock, Arkansas. That unit eventually, before I had finished 3 years in my first call, mobilized and activated to go over to Iraq. So, I then went to Iraq in 2009 with the unit, and the church had a very lovely sending, for me and support of me and my unit while I was
Mm.
overseas.
Before we get to your deployment, let's just briefly talk about what did when you were just doing reserves with that unit,
Mhm.
what did sort of the time allocation between those two sites look like for you? And were there ever any sort of time conflicts in a way where it felt like um, you were sort of needed two places at once?
Yeah, luckily, I in the congregation, I was on staff with a pretty vibrant staff, and the congregation knew before I had even come to that congregation that the Army Reserve was a part of my call and a part of my life. And so, yeah, there were times when I again, typically a reservist, particularly when they first start out as a chaplain, 1 weekend a month, a couple weeks to 1 weekend a month, and then a couple of weeks to about a month a year of couple of weeks to a month of kind of an activated time for training. So that congregation was super supportive, and we worked together as a staff with scheduling so that I was able to, I guess, straddle both worlds, and it worked out very well. So I'm lucky in that regard. Um, but most of my time, my primary call was to the parish. So yeah.
And so they had at least one other pastor who was the lead pastor there.
Mhm.
What kinds of ministry were you doing primarily in that? in that setting?
So the congregation, I think, as far as Lutheran churches go, was fairly big. So I was preaching every week. We had 5 services across a weekend, and we divided those up, teaching confirmation, um, working with different groups within the congregation, some outreach at Presbyterian Night Shelter. So, I mean, kind of in some ways, I don't know that there's a typical first call, but typical
Yeah.
first call thing: preaching, teaching, presiding, visitation,
Yeah.
within the life of the congregation.
And then the couple weekends a month that you were working on with the Army side of things, what types of things were you doing?
So again, at the time, because there were so many units still going into Iraq and Afghanistan, some of it was working with families whose service member was overseas. Some of it was preparing various people in units for their deployment and what kinds of um, counseling was necessary for that. Some of it too was me learning what is my role as a chaplain as I'm moving forward towards deployment myself and caring for the people. What are their religious preferences and backgrounds? How can I serve them, and how can I collaborate with other chaplains to make sure that the soldiers' needs are getting met?
And I assume then you kind of were able to form some relationships with the soldiers that you ended up going to Iraq with
Yes.
through that. Okay.
Yes, we had lots of training together prior to going into Iraq, and it's interesting. I would say, I don't know that this is true across the board, but in my experience, the community that we were able to create in a short time was very profound, and I still have deep connections with the people with whom I deployed and with whom I trained to deploy. That we were able to create that uh, community together very quickly.
What did your training for deployment look like
Yeah.
in that time period?
Again, some of it was, knowing what the operation was, understanding um, the rules of engagement and what was going on in the area. Some of it was just getting to know the soldiers. Some of it was understanding, how do I, as a chaplain, move around a battlefield? I'm going to move around a battlefield very differently than other soldiers because I don't carry a weapon. When should I go and when should I not go? It's important that I see the people who need to be seen, but it's also important that I don't put other people at risk because of their role for protecting me as a person who doesn't carry a weapon, as a non-combatant in in a
Mhm.
deployed environment. So some classroom training, lots of training, also, you know, uh, field experiences where we're going through drills. Some of it too was, how would I, as a chaplain, um, engage potentially key leaders to advise commanders on issues that may pop up. So
Absolutely. You said you were over there a couple of years?
I was there from 2009 to 2010, so
So
just a year.
just a year. I guess anything just specific about your time over there and how that impacted you? I imagine that impacted you in terms of ministry too, even and going forward.
Yeah.
Um,
Again, you mentioned the community, and one of the things that was very special to me was the bonds that I was able to experience with the soldiers who deployed with me. We lived together, we ate together, we brushed our teeth together. I mean, we're together, and that is a different kind of rhythm than somebody experiences in the parish. And when critical events happened, uh, as traumatic as those may have been in those moments, also in a way, as we processed them together, bound us together and called us to see um, Christ rising in places that we didn't expect. Um, so lots of, I mean, I guess lots of up and down emotions, but for me, and this is not true for everybody, my experience in that deployed environment reminded me of what we as Christians, and particularly as Lutherans, proclaim. Uh, with our theology of the cross that Christ is present where the world says Christ is not, and Christ rises in some of the most surprising places. Um, that was really beautiful.
Absolutely.
And some of the uh, g- uh, forgive me for talking a lot, but some of the witness too that I saw. So I've mentioned this in other contexts that the most kind of more recent operations, particularly with Iraq and Afghanistan, were heavily relied on civilians for a lot of the support, and a lot of those civilians came from what we call third countries. It wasn't the U.S. and it wasn't Iraq, but they were other countries across the world, and oftentimes they would be what people would categorize as two-thirds world countries, people who were living as people very much on the margins, and some of them very unfairly brought into that place. Um, one of the things I saw in the midst of uh, the tragedy of that moment was also um, kind of a vision, I guess, that vision that John has in Revelation of every tribe and every nation gathered around the throne of the Lamb and praising and proclaiming that Christ is with us, that Christ has risen. Where we had people from Ethiopia and Nepal and Fiji and Uganda, and in many ways shouldn't have been there, couldn't have been there, but here we are, and the whole world in one place around one Eucharistic table is something that I'll never forget.
Yeah, absolutely. And what was it like coming back to the United States then and going back into a parish setting after that experience?
So after that, I did not go back into a parish setting. I went to Fort Lewis, Washington, Joint Base Lewis McChord now,
This being Washington State.
Washington State. Yeah, not too far from outside of Tacoma, and I served on the garrison chaplain staff there. So I served partly working with a soldier readiness um, center, um, where soldiers coming back or going to deployed environments, offering support to them. And I was also assigned to a prison on the installation. So I did worship services in the prison and visitation in the prison. Went from there and then stayed active and went to California and served a training installation in California for 2 or 3 years, just outside of San Francisco.
Mm.
So again, worship services, training, readiness,
Yeah.
but soldier and service member family centric.
So you've really went all over and active. And how long total were you active for then?
Goodness gracious. Probably only 4-ish years, I think. Yeah. And then got out. I want to say, and I should have my timeline better, but I think it was 2013 when I went back into the Army Reserve and back to a parish.
Okay. You've been reserve since.
And I've been reserve since. Mhm.
Where was your next parish setting then?
So the next parish setting was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Yeah.
Wow, so you really have been all over. Um, well, anything particular from there that stands out, or that,
It,
or even just what was it like going back into the parish after that?
it
Work
was
that you did?
a lovely parish to go back to after having been in the military. People were very caring. People in that congregation too, very justice oriented, and lots of engagement in the community. I met a lot of good people and made a lot of really good connections. I was not in that parish very long. I think it was only 2 years, and then went to Chicago for to LSTC to took my GI Bill and uh, went back to school.
Mhm.
Um, but still have very good connections with the people in Milwaukee and with the people who were part of that congregation. It was a good it, it was a good place to land after having been deployed and around.
Yeah, absolutely. What did you go back to school for? Because I presume you already had an MDiv, right?
Yeah, so I went back for a PhD at LSTC. It took me a lot longer to go through it than I originally intended, just because I picked up some other things along the way. But PhD in theology and ethics.
Okay. So, and you completed that?
I just defended my dissertation in November, so I will technically graduate in May, this May.
Okay. Well, I guess soon to be Dr. Hedlund then perhaps should have been the introduction, but congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And is that part of what led you into a higher education setting for working here then? Or yeah, what was your journey into contextual education here?
Kind of a roundabout way. But I did think, um, both while I was still on active duty and going through my school at LSTC, that potentially I would be in some kind of um, education and environment for a call on down the line. But I moved to Columbus for family, really, and being closer to family at a particular time, and in some ways accidentally landed back at Trinity. It was a friend of mine in Chicago who had said, "Hey, there's an opening at Trinity," and I thought, well, this is just kind of
Yeah.
interesting timing. So I'm very glad to be here and to kind of be back home and have an opportunity to serve in a new capacity.
Absolutely. Um, do you feel like your doctoral studies have already started to enrich your work here and ministry, or I guess where do you see that leading you in your career going
That-
forward?
That's a really good question, and I don't know. I seem to fall into things in some ways. So I think the doctoral I had studies I had thought I'm I had thought that I had wanted to do it, but I also, having gone back to parish ministry after the military, knew in my heart that there's something about parish ministry that I really love. So even while I was going through the doctoral program, thinking that I was only going to focus primarily on studies, I ended up serving a parish in Chicago for 8 years, contracted, not called,
Yeah.
but very much a part of that community. So um, I I hope that my time of, you know, that privilege to have extra time for study and prayer, wherever I'm led, um, will bear fruit.
Yeah.
I studied theology and ethics particularly because that could be something of use to the Army as well. And as I continue in the Army Reserve, um, that ethics is something that pops up
Yep.
everywhere and in the Army, sometimes very intensely. So.
Absolutely. What does your reserve duty look like at this point as you're doing contextual education here?
So right now, my reserve duty is very different than other assignments. I'm assigned to the office of the chief of chaplain, so the Army chief of chaplain's office in accessions and recruiting. So I focus on, uh, as is in the title, accessions and recruiting. Um, I interview people who are interested in Army chaplaincy. The office sends me to various places to tell the Army story. So it's very different. I'm not embedded in a unit, and I don't have a commander in the same sense that I have had in other units. But it's a fun assignment and it's something different.
Absolutely. And I guess obviously I know what contextual education is, but as for our listeners that may not be as familiar with seminary, do you want to just talk a little bit about contextual education and what all that entails?
Sure, and you feel free to chime in because you're in the midst of pieces of your contextual education. So at Trinity, as is true across ELCA seminaries and other seminaries beyond the ELCA, we have our, kind of classroom academic requirements, but we also have field education requirements, contextual education requirements. So I think one of the things that's unique to Trinity is its 2-year internship where students have 2 years of academic study and concurrently do some learning in context where they're engaged in congregations and in um, potentially nonprofits where they're working on sites and doing hands-on ministry concurrent with their studies, and then going off onto internships where they essentially serve as apprentice pastors in a way, um, learning on the job and serving. Um, so giving students the opportunity to have hands-on, experiences as they learn.
Well, in clinical pastoral education, it's a piece of that too.
Yes. And you're headed off on clinical pastoral education very
Yep.
soon.
Yeah, and yes, working in a hospital um, setting there. So yeah, just for listeners, yeah, 3 semesters is standard for and it is learning in context. That's what LIC stands for.
Mhm.
Okay, because I've heard leadership.
Learning in context. It's also written leadership in context. So um, I've seen various.
Yep, me too. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, the analogy I make with that in relation to the internship is, um, I was briefly an education major in undergrad, and they have you do observations before you do student teaching, and that's sort of the analogy I've made with LIC and internship. The LIC, you're around the congregation, you're mostly just there. You're going to participate a little bit, but it's less formal of a role and really just kind of get feet wet. Where internship, you're actually
You're there.
yeah, you were there and you're working in that environment, and really just somebody's supervising you and giving you feedback on that. And then yeah, CPE, if you do it full time, is 10 weeks, and um, that's getting you into the hospital setting and giving you a lot of great experience with pastoral care and
Mhm.
um,
Visitation
visitation and
and
uh,
working out theology in times of
mhm,
crises too.
absolutely. Um, I guess speaking of working out theology, um, one question I always ask everyone is, what does it mean to be Lutheran and to be Christian? But I guess specifically Lutheran. And I imagine you probably have a pretty interesting perspective on that, both through all the places you've been and also some of the work you've been doing recently with your
Mhm.
doctoral work too. So
Yeah, and if you ask me, I mean, uh, I may have I may have varied answers on various days, but I think I highlighted on this a little bit. I mean, with the Lutheran understanding of theology of the cross,
mhm.
that that God in Christ emerges in the places in which the world says God is not, and other Christian traditions understand that and live that out too. I think we as Lutherans hold that as something that's central to who we are with our understanding um, of justification um, by grace through faith. That uh, for me, moving through different places and being in places that have been and can be very um, traumatic and intense. And places where, I have found myself and many other people have found themselves completely in some ways helpless, but also empowered. Um, the grace of God that comes, uh, is something, that we Lutherans hold dear, and that's something that's important to me, as a Lutheran is, seeing Christ rise again in those places that we don't expect, um, meeting God in the kind of shadowy darkness, and holding on to hope, as well. And then as a person who has moved around a lot, one of the things that I value, um, that Lutherans don't necessarily exclusively do, and we don't all we don't all do it. But there is some sense of living out the universality of the church. Our liturgies may look different in different places and contexts, but by and large, I can go into a Lutheran church and oftentimes know what the readings are going to be for that Sunday, and know that my brothers and sisters across the world are reading the same readings. That doesn't happen all the time, and that doesn't make or not make us Lutheran. But the ways that Lutherans have lived that out, again, as a person who has moved around a lot, helps center and ground me.
Absolutely. Is there anything else you'd like to add, or?
Um, again, I don't really. I know the question was being Lutheran, or
Yeah.
um, those are. I mean, for me, those are. That's at the at my core. Um, the surprising grace of Christ. I know we Lutherans don't always confess or formally do a corporate confession at the beginning of worship, but I appreciate our understanding. And we have it in our worship book. Uh, Used to be in bondage to sin, now it's captive to sin. But this holding on to that we are captive to sin and we cannot free ourselves. Um, and yet God's grace comes to us. And the reason why that's important to me, I think, having been uh, in combat, is there are so many things that happen to us again that are beyond our control. And sin is not just about the acts that we do, but living in a fallen world and being able to confess that we live in this fallen world and God's grace still comes to us, uh, has given me strength, I think, to continue on, particularly in some of the hardest times.
Absolutely. With that, I always like to end with a prayer. So please just pray with me. God, thank you for pastor, soon to be Dr. Kirsten, and just all the ways you've been able to work through her in ministry and military service, and in her studies. Just pray that she'll continue to be a blessing to your church. We pray just for all those who are currently serving in the military. Just keep them safe and bring about peace to this world. And we just pray for all those who are discerning their calls in life, whether to ministry, military service, or something else, that everyone just finds the purpose that you have intended for them. And we pray these things in your holy name. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks for listening to my interview with Pastor Kerstin Hedlund. If you haven't already, you can follow the show on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, and newly available on Substack by going to mightyfortresspod.substack.com, where you can sign up to get an email notification when new episodes come out. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord look upon you with favor and give you peace. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Mighty Fortress Is Our Pod is a production of Mighty Fortress Media. The views and opinions expressed are those of the guests and the host, and are not intended to represent the views and opinions of any Lutheran church body. Be sure to follow this show on Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube. Thanks for listening.